Hi everybody. So in this video I want to do a land acknowledgement, but also talk about land acknowledgements. You might have heard a land acknowledgement if you've been to events in different places, either at Vanier or in other places, and sometimes you might hear somebody just quickly say, "We'd like to acknowledge that we are on the territory of," and then they'll name the nation and kind of move on. I've been involved in Indigenous solidarity for a number of years, and everything that I've read from Indigenous perspectives on land acknowledgements, people often feel that it's a bit tokenistic and superficial. Let's put ourselves in a situation where somebody comes up to us and hurts us in some way, punching us or kicking us, and we fall down, and then later on the person does it again, and they just keep doing it every week, and then at some point, maybe months later, you haven't seen them in a while, and they acknowledge all those times that they punched you and pushed you down to the ground. And we say, "Yeah, I did that." And then what? And then they keep doing it. Or they don't really make any kind of attempts at repairing the harm that they created. Or somebody came into your home and stole all your stuff and kicked you out of your own home and kept all your stuff. And, years later they say, "Yeah, I did that." And that's it. So that's how land acknowledgements, without anything about education or anything about reparation, comes across to Indigenous people. Basically, it's people saying, "Yeah, we're acknowledging that we're on these stolen lands, but we're not gonna do anything about it." So I like to throw in a bit of education with my land acknowledgements. I do still think they're important because they send a message, but I think that they can't just sit there on their own without any action. And they also, I feel it's important to, if we do a land acknowledgement, talk a little bit about what else that we're doing, either as a person or as a group, depending on the context. So there's this map there, and there's going to be a link to that I'm going to give you, but this is, you see here what you know as North America, that you see highlight here, we don't see the colonial borders here of the provinces or states or between the countries. It's, all like highlighting territories, ancestral homelands of different Indigenous peoples. And if you go down, you see a few here. So there's more than that, but this hasn't all been mapped out, and it hasn't been mapped out around the world. But actually there's some stuff here in Northern Europe, because there are Indigenous peoples there as well, and Australia. And there's Indigenous people everywhere. I mean, you have some here in Asia, but you have others all over the place. They're just not necessarily on this map yet. So what is a land acknowledgement? Well, it's often they're very short and like I say, superficial, but I like to go into a bit more detail. And this is an old tradition. And so the teachings that I've gotten about land acknowledgements, you saw on that map before, there are hundreds and hundreds of Indigenous nations, not just in the past, but today. And people have always had relationships among nations. Sometimes they could be conflictual, sometimes they could be tense, but there were also alliances, partnerships, political agreements, treaties that existed before any Europeans ever showed up here, trading relationships. And so people would visit each other, and to be a good guest for a lot of people, what that looked like was acknowledging the hospitality of the people where they were visiting. So this is kind of, in a way, piggybacks on this very old tradition and practice of being a good guest, except now what's different today is that often the people who do land acknowledgements are settlers, people like me who are of our origins are from those colonial nations who came, the French, the English, to colonize and steal land, essentially, and destroy a lot of lives in the process. So I do have some indigenous descent, but I grew up as a white person, and so I think it's important to not appropriate identities that are not mine. And as I'm mostly settler, I've benefited from that theft because, you know, I get a paycheck from money that is from stolen lands. So, anyway, long story short, it's still important to kind of do that acknowledgement and go through that exercise as long as we go deeper with it. So, what you'll often hear in this place that you know as Montreal is an acknowledgement of like a Yankehaga or Mohawk peoples. And yeah, it is important to recognize them as the traditional custodians of these lands. These are unceded lands, so that's one of the first things here, traditional unceded indigenous lands. Unceded means that people never gave up this land. Okay, they never ceded this land. And so the Ganyankahaga peoples are part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and in high school you might have heard them referred to as Iroquois, but Haudenosaunee is their word for themselves. And there's also been historically a presence of Anishinaabe peoples on these lands. The Anishinaabe called this island Muniang. The Ganyankihaga peoples have called it Jojage. And this island is a very important place, and it always has been. People have gathered here, First Peoples, Indigenous peoples from all directions gathered here to trade, or, you know, other reasons that why people would gather between different nations. And still, today, it's a place that has an extraordinarily rich and vibrant Indigenous community, Indigenous people from all over the continent, but also from further out. There are Indigenous people everywhere who have dealt with the same colonial oppression and disruption. And, there are folks who are Indigenous from all over the place here as well. So, I like to be grateful and, honor these custodians and be grateful because it's because of their taking care of this land for thousands of years that I have the privilege of living and working on these lands. So I try to be a respectful guest, and what that looks like for me is to, within my work towards the success of future generations of all peoples. But also with special attention to helping to support Indigenous students who are here, because often Indigenous students face barriers to higher education. And so, for example, one of the things that I've been a part of is to co-found with some other people, Indigenous and non-Indigenous colleagues, the Vanier Indigenous Circle. And one of the things that this circle does is to work to improve services to Indigenous students, but also to educate all members of the Vanier community on Indigenous histories, cultures, worldviews, current realities, and contributions to the larger society, because there are a lot of things about Canada that wouldn't be here, including Canada itself, if it wasn't for Indigenous people. So in my courses, I try to use some principles of Indigenous pedagogy with the goal of supporting student agency and having good relations with students. It's a bit harder online, but I do what I can. So the very last slide here is if you want to know more about land acknowledgements, and I really suggest that you look at Concordia University's territorial acknowledgement page by clicking here. It's really got some fantastic information on the acknowledgement that they use and how they devised it, and they break it down part by part to explain what they're saying. And this, where it says map, if you click that, it takes you to the map that I showed you in the beginning. So it's important to keep these things in mind, because all the work that we're doing here together is taking place on stolen lands. And if you are Indigenous, and specifically, your ancestral territories are in these lands, I'm hoping that this, helps you feel like your concerns are going to be taken seriously in this course, because I know that for some Indigenous students, it's not always the case. So that's really important to me. And if you're Indigenous but not to this place, well, hopefully it's something that you can relate to, in thinking that, you know, you are a guest in this specific territory, but that you are still at home here in the college, and that your connection to your homelands are respected. And if you're not Indigenous to here or elsewhere, you can learn to be a settler in solidarity with Indigenous peoples here and everywhere.